Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's And Still I Vote Train the Trainers session on voter suppression and advocacy. I am Lindsay Langholtz, Director of Policy and Program at ACS. As many of you know, ACS is a diverse nationwide network of lawyers, law students, judges, scholars, and many others who are committed to upholding the US Constitution in the 21st century by making sure that the law is a force of improving people's lives. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. First, please note that today's call is being recorded and the recording will be available on our website, acslaw.org. So please, if you find today's session to be a valuable resource, as we believe you will, do go back to it if you need help reminding yourself of how this all flows, or share it with others in your network that you think it would be a valuable resource. Second, if you would like to ask a question at any time during the call, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions after the presentation and we'll try to address as many as possible. Finally, ACS is a 501c3 organization. As such, today's event will be focused on nonpartisan efforts to battle voter suppression and ways that you can help. The right to vote, to make one's voice heard and participate in our democracy is considered by many to be the bedrock of our system. This year, we celebrated two anniversaries: the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex, and the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race. And yet, the right to vote, so fundamental to our American government, has been denied or abridged to too many of our citizens for far too long. We are in the middle of an election season unlike any other, and I know that you have joined today to hear about how you can help break down some of these barriers to the ballot box. We've got a lot to cover, so let me kick it over to our team from the Leadership Conference who'll be leading today's training. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Lee Chapman. Lee?
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Welcome everyone to the And Still I Vote Voter Suppression Advocacy Train the Trainer training. Today we'll be taking you through the training while providing helpful trainer tips and tricks for when you go out and share this information with your networks. I'm Lee Chapman, the Voting Rights Director at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And And Still I Vote is a national call to action for people to take back the power of the vote. It's a campaign of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, empowered in part by our sister campaign, All Voting is Local. We're excited that you're joining us today to talk about voter suppression and advocacy to protect the right to vote in 2020. And thank you to the American Constitution Society for partnering with us on this important topic. So who is the Leadership Conference? We're a nearly 70-year-old organization that focuses on the communities most impacted by barriers to the vote, communities of color. And together we work to eliminate needless and discriminatory barriers to voting before they happen, to build a democracy that works for us all. With our coalition and state partners, we inform the public, decision makers, and the media about barriers to voting and advocate for policies that expand the right to vote, especially in communities of color. So right now, with 48 days until the election, everyone is talking about voting, but it's important to really understand why and how we found ourselves as a country in this moment. Before we get to all that, we wanted to show you a video that we hope you will find powerful and will help set the tone for our time together.
Voters in Randolph County, Georgia are outraged.
BALLOT made a proposal to the Board of Elections to shut down 7 of 9 polling places in the predominantly black areas.
As soon as polling places opened early this morning, the headaches began.
This is so wrong. This is just so wrong.
Now people are literally putting their lives at risk to cast a ballot.
They purged 500,000 voters.
Are you removing black voters from the voter roll just so you can win this election?
We are witnessing a tidal wave of voter suppression efforts around the country.
This is what we call voter suppression. It is not letting me vote for who I want to vote for.
huge victory in Florida.
Convicted felons across the state now have their voting rights restored.
And I promise you tonight, we're going to make sure that every vote is counted. Every single vote.
Great, thank you for that. So in the midst of assaults on the right to vote, it's critical that we fight for greater access to voting. You know, 2020, as we've heard over and over again, is the election of our lifetime, but we will not be silenced. In every corner of our country, policymakers have put up discriminatory barriers to the ballot that have shut us out. From closing polling places in Black communities to wrongfully erasing voters from the rolls, including low-income voters, seniors, and college students. They're taking away our right to vote and rigging the system for their own benefit. So we're going to quickly go over the goals for this training. A key point we want to get across today is that it's vital that we are lifting up the history of voter suppression for all and remind everyone that this is not new. It's important for people to remember that we have won before and we can win again. We want to build upon our collective skills and ideas. What we learn and discuss here should go out from here. We all bring our unique experiences and strengths to this work, and that means everyone's perspective has value. Whether you're a first-time voter or someone who has signed up to be a poll worker for 50 years, your voice is valued and needed. And we want to be sure that we all move to strengthen and grow the community of advocates to connect on this important work and serve as a resource. So specifically, our goals are: 1, to understand the history of voter suppression and what voter suppression looks like today. 2, to create a sense of urgency around voting in the time of COVID-19 and heightened racial injustice. 3, to gain an understanding around mechanism to further voting rights. And 4, to fight for voting rights with advocacy tactics to ensure greater access to voting in the time of COVID. So the COVID pandemic and the fight for racial justice have exposed the cracks in the system to many who have not been directly impacted before, and with the voices of those who have lived this reality every day being amplified in our streets. These deepening cracks in vital systems can't be ignored. At our nation's founding, voting was enshrined only for educated white men who owned property. And it took more than a century for the franchise to meaningfully expand to people of color, women, people with disabilities, people who are low income, and Native Americans. And today, some elected leaders are still working to silence people who were historically denied access to the ballot box. Voting and the ability to participate in our democracy is a racial justice issue, it is a civil rights issue, and we are overdue for a change. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nivesha, who is going to talk about some of the state work that we are currently engaging in.
So thanks, Lee. Thank you so much for that. And so, as Lee said, my name is Nivesha Noble, and I'm a regional field manager at the Leadership Conference. And so, before I get started, I do want to share a short story of myself on why I came to this work. And just a quick trainer's note and tip. If you're giving this training to some other people in your network, you want to be sure to be able to tell your story of self. And this helps create a stronger connection to your audience and will help ground people in the history and ensure that participants understand and begin to understand why this work means so much to you. And then that's a way that you can be able to kind of create some alignment and understanding. And people are like, oh, okay, that's similar to why I come to this work. So I'm going to share my story of work and then go into the state overview. So as Lee just mentioned, voter suppression is not a new issue. It's an issue that has been going on for years. When I was younger, I used to go visit my grandparents and my great-grandparents in the rural South, and they would share so many stories about how hard it was for them to vote or how they didn't even have the opportunity to vote. At a young age, I didn't always understand and appreciate the things that they were sharing. But one thing that stuck out to me was how important they said voting is, and how when I turn 18, I should make sure that I am registered to vote. And they were basically letting me know that I need to be registered to vote because so many of our ancestors and people to come before me had fought so hard for this right to vote. And they had a lot of barriers that they had to go through if they were even able to vote at all. So they always wanted to make sure that when I turn 18, I exercise my right to vote, because everybody should be able to vote and should not have any barriers that get in their way. And so now that I'm older, I'm happy to be able to be working for an organization that is really educating people about voter suppression and ways that they can kind of get involved and be able to be an advocate and be that voice for everyone and elevate stories and so forth. And that's essentially what our All Voting is Local campaign was founded to do. We do that work in partnership with organizations in states like yours. Our ABLE team is on the ground in 8 states, where our mission is to expose and prevent discriminatory barriers to the ballot before Election Day. And fallout from the most recent primaries makes it abundantly clear that we must act now to ensure every citizen can freely and fairly vote in the upcoming general election. And chaos at polling places in recent primaries has demonstrated that election officials have not done enough to date to hold safe and accessible elections during this pandemic. And just to share some examples, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, voters stood in line for hours at one of only 5 polling places down from 180. Voters had to find someone to serve as a witness to validate their ballot, even though there was a stay-at-home order because of the pandemic. The GOP bought 11th hour legal challenges that undid changes like deadline extensions that are just common sense during a pandemic. In Georgia, voting machines broke down, poll workers received inadequate training, and voters stood in line for up to 7 hours in the heat and humidity because they never got their absentee ballots. And hearing some of these stories, it just brings clear that, again, as mentioned earlier in the introduction, the barriers to the ballot and barriers to just voting in general are not new. So the things that my grandparents were sharing with me about what they had to endure, some of these barriers are actually still coming up, which is why it's even more important for us to really fight for this, because we really need to see change. This is modern day voter discrimination, plain and simple. Voters in all these states risk their health and that of their communities to make their voices heard. People should be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote and stay healthy even during a pandemic. We should not have to choose between public health and a functioning democracy. State officials still have time, and this is where you all come in. Our AVO campaign and advocates across the states are calling on officials to immediately take steps to respond to the current moment, where the pandemic is threatening access to the ballot. And we're already seeing signs of progress. So although there are still a lot of things that still need to be done, we can highlight some of the progress that we have seen. So examples, in Pennsylvania, which previously voted only 4% by mail, processed a record of 2 million ballot applications for the primary. Key cities in Michigan are setting up drop boxes so that voters can securely return their ballots and feel confident they'll count. In Georgia, we helped to kill a bill that would have prohibited sending a ballot application to every registered voter, one of the most common sense steps officials can be taking right at this moment. Wisconsin Elections Commission recently announced a plan to send a ballot application to every registered voter. And Milwaukee decided to offer 16 early voting locations, up from just 3 in the 2016 presidential election. So again, there are things that we want to highlight and show that there are signs of progress, but again, as we're giving this training, we still have some work to do. And the work doesn't just stop there. We can't see another Wisconsin, another Georgia in November. And with your help, we will not have to. I'm going to turn this back over to my colleague Lee to ground us in the history of the struggle for voting rights.
Thanks, Navesha. So I come to this work because my grandmother, who grew up in rural North Florida during segregation, how difficult it was to vote for our family. She never missed an election and emphasized the importance of voting and participating in our election. And I started my journey on advancing voting rights by registering voters at a local mall when I was in middle school. So voting is power, and we have a long way to go until we reach full participation in the voting process. And it is critical that we understand our history and how voter suppression is tied to systemic racism and white supremacy, starting at the founding of our country when only white male landowners could cast their ballot. They made up of 5% of the population. We saw the franchise expand with African American men with the 15th Amendment, and during Reconstruction, 16 African Americans were elected to Congress. But then there was an immediate contraction on the right to vote, with states implementing restrictions like poll taxes, all-white primaries, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, felony disenfranchisement laws, and voter intimidation at the polling place, which prohibited Black voters, particularly those in the South, from casting a ballot. So in order for Black voters to register to vote, they were faced with impossible restrictions, like counting how many jelly beans were in a jar, or how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, or reciting the entire preamble of the United States Constitution. And here's a trainer tip. This would be a really great time if you wanted to do some type of polling of the audience around the different amendments and voting rights. So we saw an expansion of the right to vote when women were given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. The suffragist story is long and complicated. The organized movement started off closely aligned with the abolitionist movement and lasted from around 1848 with the first Women's Rights Convention in New York to 1920, when the amendment was ratified by 38 states. In other words, it took almost 70 years, 3 generations of women and advocates before it was law. So this year marks the 100 years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and many Americans believe they know the full story of American suffrage for women. However, there's an untold history of women's suffrage and the women of color suffragists who fought for the right to vote. So while we often hear the names of suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, there were many women of color who were critical in the movement, including Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Nina Otero Warren, and Louise McDonald Hearn of the Mohawk Nation, and many others. Black women also weren't treated equally during the suffrage movement, and during the 1913 march, Black women were told to march in the back and weren't able to march next to white women. So the movement continued after 1920 for all the women who didn't get the right to vote then. And shortly after the 19th Amendment was passed, many states passed laws prohibiting Mexican, Chinese, and Native American women from voting. It would be decades until most Black American women were able to achieve the right to vote. And it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that finally eliminated many of those obstacles for women of color. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was critical because it was signed after years of struggle in the civil rights movement. And lastly, when the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, we had another expansion of the right to vote, which lowered the voting age to 18. But I wanted to focus on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it was passed to ensure that state and local governments do not deny American citizens the equal right to vote based on their race, color, or membership in a minority language group. It banned literacy tests and similar devices like what I mentioned that were used to disenfranchise voters of color. And this momentous piece of legislation enshrines the right of every citizen an equal opportunity to participate in our democracy. The Voting Rights Act is the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed in our country. And even though we've made progress after the Voting Rights Act, this year marks the 55th anniversary of the passage, the right to vote remains under threat. So we're currently seeing assaults on all fronts. Courts are rolling back voting rights protections and greenlighting voter purges in states like Ohio and Georgia. With the executive branch, we've seen a lack of voting enforcement by the Department of Justice and a continued false narrative from the White House promoting rigged elections and vote by mail fraud, which are really designed to deter and intimidate people from participating in our elections. And with the legislative branch and state legislatures, we've seen a flood of restrictive voting policies like strict voter ID laws, restrictions on voter registration, and cuts to early voting. And at the federal level, we've seen key voting access bills like H.R. 1 for the People Act and H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, blocked by the Senate because of partisanship. So I wanted to talk about how we got here, and one key piece is a court case called Shelby County versus Holder. So in 2013, 5 justices of the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was a powerful preclearance provision which required states and election jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination to obtain approval by the Department of Justice or a federal court before implementing new laws or policies. Since 2013, we've seen the floodgates of voter suppression open and have seen a wave of restrictive voter ID laws, polling place closures, voter purges, and restrictions on voter registration. And we've seen 200 restrictive voting bills introduced in 40 states. We've seen the largest rollback of voting rights in a century and 25 new restrictive voting laws on the books. And all of these laws disproportionately impact voters of color. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our major federal priorities right now in the voting space. And while elections are administered on the state and local level, there's a lot that Congress can actually do. So the HEROES Act is one of them. This year, in addition to all the voter suppression issues that we were already facing, election administrators have been struggling with the challenges posed by COVID-19. Many of you have seen the images from Wisconsin and Kentucky and other places around the country with long lines and polls closing. And voters should not have to choose between their health and participating in our democracy. So the Leadership Conference and our coalition, we were advocating for the HEROES Act, which included $3.6 billion in essential funding for safe and accessible elections. It also included $25 billion for the United States Postal Service and would allow states to expand voter registration, same-day registration, vote by mail, have at least 2 weeks of early voting, and have safe in-person voting on Election Day. And the bill passed the House of Representatives, but unfortunately it has yet to pass the Senate. The second big legislative priority we have is the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is now renamed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act after his passing. And that bill passed the House last year, but it has not passed the Senate. And this bill is critical because it would reinstate the pre-clearance system that was gutted by the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder. And it would prevent states from enacting discriminatory voting practices. If we had H.R. 4 in place, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, we can prevent voter registration purges that affect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of voters, all because they may have missed an election or two. We can prevent implementation of photo ID laws that we know disproportionately prevent voters of color and younger voters from casting ballots. We can prevent jurisdictions from reducing the level of language assistance provided to citizens at the polls. We can prevent gerrymandering that dilutes Black and brown votes. We can prevent the elimination of polling places, particularly in communities of color. And we can prevent any additional requirements and documentation like citizenship paperwork that many just don't have access to. So now I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Lindsay Walker, who's going to talk about COVID-19 and racial justice. Lindsay?
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much, Lee, for that introduction. First, I just want to tell you a little bit about how I've come to this work. Once again, my name is Lindsay Walker, and I'm a field associate with the Leadership Conference. When I was in the 10th grade, I moved from Nova. Some of you guys who are familiar with the DC area know that's Northern Virginia, to Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now, Fredericksburg has a lot of Civil War history. And when I made that move, it was clear that I was in a different world. When this move was made, I remember vividly being surprised to see Confederate flags on a regular basis. They were on backpacks, they were on t-shirts, they were flown proudly in people's front yards. And it was very, very clear that I lived among people that had strikingly different views than me. Later in my senior year, I had an amazing AP government teacher named Miss Maston. She had a passion for her work, and it shined through on behalf of her students. There also was a presidential re-election campaign happening, but there was one problem. I was only 17, and although I couldn't vote, I could volunteer. And despite me not being eligible to cast my ballot, I could work to be sure that hundreds of voters were registered and ensure that they knew where they needed to go to vote. I ended up volunteering for a campaign and fell in love with civic engagement and helping people get out to the polls. But now let's just get into these barriers to the ballot. So COVID-19 has exacerbated barriers to the ballot, and we cannot ignore them. And you can act now to change this. Now, there is a long list of barriers to the ballot on the screen, but I'm just going to give a few examples of these. Moving and consolidation, closure of polling places. Last year, the Leadership Conference issued a report, and we found that there were over 1,600 polling place closures in former Section 5 states. Voters should never have to wait more than 30 minutes to vote, especially during a pandemic. Voter ID. Now, this is another hoop that a lot of voters have to jump through depending on what state they live in the country. This also primarily affects college students, because if you are a college student, it's possible that you're registered to vote at your college campus, but still have an out-of-state driver's license. So let's say you're going to the polls on election day and they require voter ID. In that case, what you would need is what they call a zero-sum bill, which pretty much has your name and your dorm address on it and says, you know, Lindsay Walker owes $0 for his electricity bill. Another barrier is just showing proof of citizenship. There also are purges and other voter registration issues. Now, voter purges have become an increasingly big problem in our country. And between 2016 and 2018, over 17 million voters were purged from the rolls. Criminal disenfranchisement and language access are also other huge barriers. Now, during COVID, voters will be less likely to register in person, obviously because of social distancing concerns. A change that's impacting millions of people who register and update their registration in a presidential election year. States need to identify alternative ways for voters to access registration, including making sure their online voter registration systems are ready for a surge in traffic capacity. Specific barriers to voting during COVID include misinformation about voting and misinformation about its impacts. This is something that we've seen in the 2016 election on Facebook, and this is something that we're seeing right now online as well. There's intimidation at the polls. That's something we've seen during the primaries early this year in states like Wisconsin. And there is a need for accurate voting information in multiple language, and that's even more necessary. The protest context. With protests happening in many areas, there is a greater presence of law enforcement or even uniformed military, making it an intimidating climate. So at a lot of different polling places in some black areas and where there are big communities of color, you're seeing police at polling locations, and that really does intimidate some folks. And this is something we've seen in Native communities as well. So what can we do about it? We can do so many different things. Firstly, we can advocate, we can educate and communicate, and last but not least, we have to protect the vote. So some of these things and I'm sure some of these things you've already helped lead on, but it's always good to name them so that we're on the same page. So just an overview on what we need to do to protect the vote in 2020. First, voter registration. Second, voter education. This is part of that. Thirdly, communication, outreach to elected officials, legislative activities, election protection, and movement building and ballot initiatives. Super, super important. So moving on to what you can do to take action. I know you're at your computer right now, but if you have your mobile device or an iPad, or you just want to minimize this presentation really quick, please go to instilivote.org. This is our website where you'll be able to take action on important issues and hear updates as they go. And just a little speaker's note, another thing you can do when you're giving these presentations is always throw in, a few anecdotes about your experience, about the materials you're presenting, just so that you can, inject yourself and inject kind of some knowledge that you've learned, through your experiences. So, voter registration. Now, this is really, really important. for you to, one, know your deadline. Now, voter registration deadlines can change depending on what state you're in, but typically voter registration deadlines are at the beginning of October. So like I said earlier, in-person voter registration activities have heavily been affected by unfolding events. We encourage you to consider virtual voter registration campaigns utilizing the 50-state tool available on vote411.org, developed by the League of Women Voters, which is also being updated as the election processes and dates change. So like I said earlier, know your deadline. Some states actually have same-day registration. Some states have online voter registration. And you want to make sure you're educating your friends, your families, and your neighbors on voter registration. Be sure to connect with voter advocacy groups for assistance with advocacy. So this is really important. I highly encourage you to kind of tap into local networks because they will be a little bit more in the loop about what your state laws are, like among like deadlines, if there's same day voter registration, and online voter registration. So voter education. So you really want to be sure that you're incorporating voter education into every activity, outreach, and get out the vote activities. Now, can you add key dates to a neighborhood bulletin? Do you have a house of worship? What if you added a quick message on that bulletin board, or if you added something in a sermon? Polling place lookup and registration lookup. Now, this is another big point because let's say you move and you're in the same city. It's possible for you to, move across the street to an apartment building and have a totally different polling location than you did before. So it's really, really important that we're checking our polling places, we're checking our registration. Most importantly, if you move or change locations. We want to be sure that we're engaging move-in groups on the ground to incorporate voter education into their advocacy. Strategic communications, story collection. So there are a few key points to remember when it comes to good story collection. First, you want to be sure that you're not taking stories. It's more ideal to provide a platform for others to tell their own lived experiences. Good story collection is always rooted in lived experiences of the community in voting. It's community-led and community-dictated. So when you're doing story collection and you find a story, and let's say that person's story isn't grammatically correct, or it's in Spanglish or something else. If that's the story you want to use, you want to be sure that you're keeping the essence and you're keeping the style of the story because, like I said earlier, that's someone's lived experience. So you don't want to dilute it. You don't want to change it. You don't want to tweak it to make it more palatable to a specific audience. You're always looking to uplift people's stories and experiences in voting. And this doesn't mean that stories won't be negative, but you should never engage in telling sad stories just for the sake of telling stories and to put people's lives on display. You must be sure that these stories serve a very clear purpose and that you tell those who provide them what you'll do with them. So that's a big key point. When you are using someone's story, you want to be sure that you're being completely transparent about what you're going to do with it and what your motivations are for collecting their story in the first place. So you can help uplift stories in many, many different ways. One of the ways are op-eds, letters to the editor, and social media outreach. Op-eds are pretty, productive and, impactful because it's pretty much a way for a person to give their little tweaks or give their critique or rebuttal about a popular, news article or statement, just to kind of give the reaction, the response of a different community. So now with all of that being said, we're going to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of messaging, and I'm just going to pass it back to my colleague, Lee Chapman.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'm going to briefly just talk about messaging. So our primary goal with messaging is to shine a spotlight and activate our audiences to fight against discriminatory barriers to the ballot in their local communities in a way that resonates. So one thing that we've said multiple times throughout this training is the term voter suppression. But we actually prefer the term barriers to the ballot or discriminatory barriers or needless barriers instead of voter suppression because it helps most listeners understand the problem and frames a story in a losing argument. So basically, whenever you're talking to like your base or people that you know are with you, you can use the term voter suppression. But if you're talking to other audiences that might not think necessarily the way that you think, you would say, you know, we don't want voters to face barriers to the ballot, like voter ID laws or like voter purges, for instance. Elected officials. So we talked about the importance of meeting elected officials in your state and community to ensure access to the ballot during this pandemic. You know, we're in a pandemic, so it's hard to like meet in person, but you can have virtual meetings with election officials with key community partners organized and led by impacted communities. And you can, we have a toolkit that we will share with you. And we have a list of top 10 steps that election officials should be taking during this pandemic. And that's a really good thing to walk through while you're having these election official meetings. We also wanted to talk a little bit about the United States Postal Service. I'm sure many of you have heard about the recent cuts to the United States Postal Service. And when Postmaster General Louis DeJoy took office in June, he swiftly took multiple actions that created a mail slowdown across the country at a time when an effective postal service is needed more than ever to provide essential services and handle vote by mail. And these actions included ordering employees to leave mail and packages behind rather than work overtime or make multiple trips to complete their routes, as many of them had been doing to address a pandemic-related shortage and increase package demand. So under DeJoy's watch, the USPS also removed 671 high-speed mail sorting machines, which have the ability to process 30,000 pieces of mail an hour. And blue collection boxes were removed from neighborhoods across the country. So the Leadership Conference and our coalition are demanding that the United States Postal Service is fully funded and that they're given $25 billion in funds, and that all election mail be treated as first-class mail, and that you know, everything should be restored to its original state. So those 671 high-speed sorting machines that were removed should be replaced. We must keep pressure on election officials to be sure that, you know, every voter can vote safely and securely this election, whether it's in person or by mail. The United States Postal Service is really the only entity that can handle vote by mail, and postal workers have been handling these ballots effectively for many years. The US Postal Service handles 3 billion pieces of mail in the week before Christmas, and managing vote by mail won't be a problem as long as the current administration lets postal workers do their job. So another really key resource that we promote as the Leadership Conference and our coalition is election protection. And election protection is a hotline, and the phone number is 1-866-OUR-VOTE. And you can be an election protection nonpartisan volunteer, who are really the first line of defense against restrictive election laws, COVID-related voting disruptions, or anything else that could silence people's voices. So election protection volunteers do this by monitoring polling places. You can do it from your vehicle or with proper PPE. They do watchdogging of social media for disinformation, or reaching out to voters to make sure they know their rights. Then they connect voters with trained legal professionals who can help them navigate the voting process and cast their ballots safely and securely. So we want to get into what you can do to protect the right to vote. There are 5 key things that we recommend that you can do. One is sharing reliable and accurate information about voting. And we have a resource page on our website at instillivote.org. You can also tell election officials in your state and community that they need to ensure access to the ballot during this pandemic. You know, it really is their job. Contact your Secretary of State's office to let them know we need safe, fair, and healthy elections. You can tell 5 friends to make a plan to vote. You know, voting this year is going to take a little bit more effort than other years. People really need to think through how they're going to vote, whether it's going to be in person or by mail. You know, we're really encouraging people to vote early if they can and safely. Also, tell your voting story on instillivote.org. We have a story collection piece where you can tell your story about what voting means to you, and also if you faced any barriers to voting. And also become an election protection volunteer or a poll worker. And we are partnering with this organization called Power the Polls on poll worker recruitment. And poll workers are so critical because they are really the backbone of our elections. There's a chronic shortage of election poll workers, and that really threatens our democratic process. And this threat is critical amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Even in a normal year, more than half of cities and counties struggle to recruit enough poll workers needed to run free and fair elections, causing long lines to the polls. Waits tend to be the longest at polling places that serve communities of color, where voters have historically faced barriers to the ballot. And poll workers have vital responsibilities. They set up voting machines, they hand out ballots, they assist voters with disabilities or language access issues. They check in voters, and they also review their IDs where they're required. And they get paid. So how do you become a poll worker? You can sign up here, Power the Polls /ACS, and we also have a partnership with them through Power the Polls, All Voting is Local, and Leadership Conference. And one thing is, make sure you follow up, because a lot of county election officials are overwhelmed right now. So if you haven't heard from the city or county within 2 weeks or so of signing up to be a poll worker, just give them a call to make sure that you know when your training is, and also when you can expect to get your polling place assignment. So we're gonna just run through a few tactics quickly that you can do to help protect the right to vote this election cycle. One of them are patch through calls, which are really a fast and cost-effective way to connect supporters to key decision makers. By getting volunteers to call voters, you can identify people who support your cause, you can educate them about an issue, and connect the supporter to their representative. You can also do text-a-thons. I'm sure you're getting a lot of texts right now from various potential candidates. So that's one thing that you can do also on the nonpartisan side. Twitter storms are also very popular that people use to draw attention to a specific issue on Twitter by creating tweets that include specific hashtags. As Lindsay mentioned, you can also do letters to the editor. People are now doing virtual rallies since we can't do rallies in Capitol buildings and what have you. You can also host virtual house parties. And if you have funding from your organization, you can do social media ad buys. So just a tip as far as training, you can ask people who you're training to provide examples of when they've used these tactics. Okay, so now we are about to close out and we are going to show one more video.
They tried to silence me.
They tried to block me. They tried to deny me.
To scare me.
To scare me.
They tried to erase me.
To erase me.
Erase me.
They tried to keep me down.
Keep me down.
Keep me down.
They tried to make me visible. Invisible.
They tried to pretend I don't matter.
Pretend my people don't matter.
But my people don't matter.
They tried to kill me.
Kill me.
Kill me.
They tried to suppress me.
Okay. Suppress me.
They tried to block me. They tried to suppress me. They tried to deny me.
And still.
And still.
And still.
And still, I vote.
I vote. Todavía voy a votar.
And still, I vote.
I vote.
Still, I vote.
And still, I vote.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today at this training. I think you might have seen some faces that you recognize in that video. We really hope we've done a good job in outlining why this moment is so important with the intersection of voter suppression, racial injustice, and systemic oppression during a global pandemic. Your work to ensure safe, accessible, and fair elections in 2020 is critical, and we really want to support you in this work. So thank you, and I wanted to turn it back over to Lindsay because I think we might have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, just a reminder, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box so that we can see them on our end, and we'll get them to our panelists. I also wanted to let you know that after this presentation, we'll be emailing out to everybody not only the toolkit that was referenced, but also the slides and a script so that you can walk through this training as well. So be looking for that in your inbox. And I believe I just answered Marissa's question. So hopefully be looking for that, Marissa. If you have any other questions, please put them in the box. But so far we've got none in. So I will ask a question to give people a minute or two to get theirs in. When thinking about training, what is the most important thing that you have found to convey during the training, or tips or tricks in how to get people to actually take action, as opposed to, you know, listen to the material and then walk away and not do anything with it?
Sure, I defer to Innovation and Lindsay on this question because they're in our field department, and so they oversee training in many different issues, not just voting.
Take it easy and tag team with me. But the first thing is just like, I think the biggest thing is like really understanding and knowing your audience, right? So when you're doing the training, you want to definitely meet people where they are. And so that being said, like one thing I would say is just like, it really comes into people want to know about the information, such as history and things like that, but people really want to know, what can I do? How can I actually act right now? And some people automatically assume, like, oh, it's just like legislation or something, but there's so many things people do. And so I think that in the training, highlighting the different ways you can get engaged. Some people like to write, and so op-eds and letters to editors are for them because that's what they like to do. Or some people are just like digital wizards are always on social media, and that's a great way to get it because that's a huge network, and you're able to like share a lot of information. So like when I'm training, I try to focus on those tactics that people can really resonate with. And I know that a lot of people usually have a lot of stories that they resonate with and that they want to share about their experience.
Navisha, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I can kind of understand what you're saying, but you sound a little bit underwater. So maybe we can readjust if you like dial in on your phone. I know we probably don't have much time for questions, but I got most of what you said.
Yeah, okay. I'll pass it to you so you can take over.
Yeah, but basically what Navisha was saying was that it's important to know your audience, so kind of having an idea of who's joining the call. And most important, I think one of the most important parts would be, one, the education piece at the beginning, because that kind of centers like why this work is so important and kind of the historic barriers that have been put in place and kind of what that looks like now. But additionally, towards the end, the advocacy section is really important as well, because we want to make sure people know like what they can do now to make a difference, like what actions they can take to protect the vote. So with that being said, I think the education aspects are really important, the historical like context. And then towards the end, like the advocacy pieces are crucial.
Yeah, and this is totally customizable, so you can like keep or cut what you need, or even customize it for your specific state and talk about barriers in your state, or how people are taking action there.
Along those lines,
agreed.
A question about whether or not one person can do this whole training, or is it best to have a couple of different presenters, especially when considering you have to run slides as well?
Yeah, I would recommend a few different presenters unless, like for instance, I'm actually doing a training tomorrow by myself for some students in Houston, and I'm going to cut it down significantly just to make it more manageable for myself. But yeah, you could, if you want to do the full training, we would recommend multiple people, and it just kind of also switches it up, you know, to have more than one person presenting. And typically we would have actually one additional person, but she wasn't able to make it today. So.
A couple of questions on how lawyers specifically can volunteer their legal skills, but then also I want to add on to that. Would you suggest reaching out to the organization before doing the training to make sure that you're filling their needs, or is it okay to go ahead and do it and then connect with them after?
So for lawyers, I'm an attorney as well. I would recommend that you volunteer with election protection. So that's run by the Lawyers Committee. And so they have nonpartisan election protection volunteers. You can help voters in a boiler room, you know, answering hotline calls. You can also serve as a poll monitor outside of polling places or even inside, depending on what the laws are in your particular state. So it's a really rewarding experience. You can do it during early voting or on election day. So I would encourage attorneys to do that. Also, Common Cause works with election protection, and Common Cause has nonpartisan election protection volunteers for non-lawyers. So people who are not lawyers can also volunteer with election protection. As far as the training, the way we've been doing it is, I think it's good to reach out to the group that you want to train. You know, you can preview and send them a copy of the training in advance. If they want it tailored in a specific way, you can do that as well. So I think it's important to have a conversation with the group that you're going to train before you do it.
Yeah, just seconding that point that Lee just made. For these trainings, we've always, like, it is a lot of work, but we've always reached out to the organizations we're doing the trainings for, just to kind of get context on the audience and making sure that we're covering all the things they have concerns about. And as it's kind of gone on, we've added more content to the training. So for instance, the stuff on the women's suffrage movement was added because we did a training with Supermajority, and they were like, okay, are you guys gonna talk about this? And we were just like, yeah, sure. And we added some slides. And then additionally, we added some slides on the postal issue because that was a big hot thing that people were really, really concerned about that we needed to address. So definitely encourage you guys to have conversations with folks before you do the training.
Excellent. And I know this training was designed so that people could take it to their own personal networks, their friends and their families. Do you have tips on how to advertise to get the word out to folks, to be able to pull together a group if they're not necessarily a chapter leader, but if they're, you know, in their community and want to pull something together just for their personal network?
Lindsay, do you have an answer to that one? How to advertise the training?
To be honest, we haven't really done most of the promotion for these trainings. It's been more so like a group has asked us to kind of lead something, and they do the promotion, and we're just more so focusing on the content. But with that being said, I think social media probably would be the best method for promotion. So if you have a big following on Facebook or Instagram, making sure to promote it that way would be pretty impactful.
And I would say recording it too is important, because if people can't watch it live, they can watch it later. We also did one with an organization called J Street, and they live streamed it, I believe, on Facebook or posted it on their Facebook. So I think there's other ways that you can get the word out. Even if you might not have like the best response, you know, make sure that other people can see it after you conduct the training.
And just to add, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, you sound much
okay. And also another thing is tying it to an action. So sometimes, like we were talking about, consolidating the slides. So say, for instance, if you're, I don't know, an example of that you're doing on your campus. And so you have a group that you're trying to present to, and then say at the end, we'll work on, I don't know, a letter to the editor that we will send out as a group to kind of like push out voting rights and protecting the vote. And people are usually more inclined to want to kind of come to that because they feel like they're a part of doing something as opposed to just learning a bunch of information and not necessarily knowing what to do about it. And then, yeah, I think that that's just like a really good way, or like those tactics that Lee went through about like the patch-through calls and the textathons and all those different things. If you're able to do any of those tactics, that might be a great way to kind of also advertise, and then people can actually be doing something while they're learning. So they learn the information, but then they can also utilize it in that moment.
Excellent. I believe that we are through all of our submitted questions. Any last words of advice before we conclude for the afternoon?
No, just thank you so much for attending, and thanks so much ACS for having us. We were really happy to be able to participate. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will be sending you that follow-up information as well.
Well, thank you all so much. I know a lot of time went into this, and we really appreciate you sharing with our network. And we are hoping that everybody on the line and watching the recording take this forth and go forth and spread the good word. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.